right, welcome to the next of Amtgard Leadership University Spotlight Interviews. This one again, we're sitting down with Duke Sir Gorin, and we're going to talk about another one of his book releases. This one is Gorin's Book of War. Talks a lot about battle games, tournaments, things like that. Gorin, thanks again for taking us some time to sit down with us this afternoon.
No problem.
So, tell us about the Book of War. What is it? Why is it?
The Book of War is part of a project that I've been working on unofficially or informally for a really long time. But it's sort of a champion's guide to building battle games and running tournaments. The main focus is definitely building battle games. And it's sort of a summary of how I feel battle games should be designed and implemented. And it uses a lot of the trials, and errors and mistakes and lessons that I've learned over the last 15, almost 16 years now. Just for some background, I've run in the position of champion 7 times, and whenever I've run as Monarch 5 times now, and I spent a lot of time as Monarch coordinating field activities as well. So spent a lot of time running battle games, and the Book of War really helps to understand what a battle game is, and how to avoid running bad ones, because good battle games are just one of the most important foundations for a successful park. If you have good battle games, you will have lots of players, lots of enthusiastic people, and they will subsequently be enthusiastic about leadership, making garb, and all the other things that we get into in Amtgard.
Okay, so let's start at the basics. What's a battle game?
Well, that's one of the very first questions that the book answers. It literally says, what's a battle game? A battle game, at its very basic, is a struggle between 2 or more opposing teams. And so as you design a battle game, that's where you start. And then you have to ask yourself, okay, who is struggling? So, you have to identify who the teams are, how many of them there are, and then how are they struggling? So you have to decide, are they just attempting to annihilate each other? Are they fighting over an objective? Are they trying to complete multiple things? And so you start building on that concept of 2 teams struggling. I mean, that's what every competition ever is. Even if it's 1-on-1 or 100-on-100, there's 2 different, entities struggling over something.
Okay. So then, again, we're going to follow right along the lines with the book. So the next one talks about the aspects that make a game fun, or the requirement for teamwork, the chance for victory, and then hopefully being a component of that success. Do you mind elaborating on those a little bit?
Not at all. Those are so important, and they're missing from so many games. So the first thing I like to ask people when they're building a battle game is think about battle games that you've played. Now identify the ones in which you had fun, and then ask yourself, why did I have fun? Because there are definitely games where you don't have fun, and you can pretty much identify what made it not fun. But a lot of times people don't take the time to identify what made a game fun. Generally, in my experience, players have fun when they're part of the reason that the team won, and when the victory is not assured. So I always try to design a battle game and set it up so that throughout the entire battle game, there's as close to a 50-50 chance of winning as possible. And my goal always is at the end of the game, it's so close that nobody really cares who won. Because the struggle is far more important than the outcome in an Amtgard battle game. There's nothing really riding on it. So the actual journey itself is way better than the destination. And when I walk away from games and someone asks, which team won? And I'm like, I don't care. I'm getting ready for the next game. That's a great game to me. So that's a big part of it. So like you said, the odds of victory. You want them to be as close to 50-50 as possible. And then do you have an opportunity to contribute to the success of your team? That's huge. If you design games that are all around killing players, then your good fighters get to contribute to that success. Okay? Your poor fighters get to be the people upon which it is contributed. And that's not fun for them, especially if that's what you do all the time. And so, eventually they might learn how to fight better out of it, but they're not going to have a great time the whole time. So it's really important to find ways to make sure that everybody has a chance to contribute to the success of their team.
Okay. So we talked about what makes it fun. Are there any don't do's or what makes it less fun?
Tons of them. And the sad thing is that in my experience, and I've traveled throughout Amtgard a lot. For being way out in the boondocks here, I try to do a lot of traveling, and I see it over and over and over again in the games I play. These just very common mistakes that people make. The first is making it too confusing. Simplicity is the key when you're designing a battle game. The more complex you make it, the more confusing it gets. And I have a concept that I like to explain to my Reeves, and I refer to it as the confusion factor. And the confusion factor is simply how confusing is this game to your players? And so when they say, well, I want to do this in the battle game, and I say, does that add to or remove from the confusion factor? If it adds to, then you want to really think about it, and you want to find ways to mitigate that as much as possible. And then there's just tons of little design factors that can make a game just really not fun. For an easy example is putting, if playing capture the flag and having the flag sitting 10 feet from a spawn point. I see that all the time, and it drives me crazy because nobody has fun when they grab the flag and someone yells alive and hits them. That's just it, and that's so avoidable by just separating the two. So those kinds of things can totally make a game unfun.
Now, building right on that, and you talked about your confusion factor and trying to minimize the complexity. You start moving into trying to establish a common language.
Yeah.
What is that all about?
So I touched on that a little bit at the panel at Clan, but it's something that I strive for in with my field officers, which are my champion, my GMR, my Reeves, is to get everybody on board with the idea of a common language. And V8 is great because I've been using this concept in my battle games for a long time. The V8 team applied pretty much the same concept to the entirety of V8, which is that there's this one word or two words that describe a whole bunch of rules, that once somebody learns what those rules are and associated with that word, you never really have to reference the rules themselves again. You can just use the word.
Just to make it easy, can you give me an example?
I'm rolling right into that.
Okay.
So a good example is we play Capture the Flag. And every time we play Capture the Flag, there's different rules for the flag. Can you run with it? Can you not run with it? Do you hold it in one hand or two hands, etc.? So for all of those different scenarios, we created tags. And a good example that when we use is the tag heavy. And the tag heavy is always followed by a number. So it's heavy 2, heavy 3, heavy 4. The number that follows it is the number of hands that have to be in contact with the object in order to move it. So if you pick up a flag and it's heavy 2, that means you need 2 empty hands on it in order to move it. It's really easy for me to explain. If I say, hey, we're doing a caravan battle, this box is heavy 5. I don't have to explain any more than that. And everybody knows that, okay, we need 5 hands on it in order to move it. We've actually played games in which the objects were a variable heaviness. So we had an object that was represented by a reeve, and the opposing team could affect that reeve to make him heavier, essentially. We called the game Fat Princess. If you ever played a video game, it's kind of fun. And he would just hold up a finger for for every, and so they would look, he's got 5 fingers up, 5 people, or 5 hands need to touch him before he'll move. And that would go up and down throughout the game. And that was a whole separate objective, was to make the princess as fat as possible.
Okay. Obviously make it then more difficult.
Right. More difficult to move it.
Okay. Do you have any other tags that come to mind?
Yeah, a couple that we use pretty common are locked. And so if a flag is locked, that means that you have to say unlocking 1 through 10 before it can be moved. And then we have another one, which is complex, which if you were to put it on a flag, once you get it to the scoring point, you have to say, scoring 1 through 10 in order to score with it. So if you wanted to have a game in which a team had plenty of time to defend a flag, you could make a locked, heavy 2, complex flag. That's one sentence. And if everybody understands that language, those, fairly complicated rules are very easy to convey. And say, okay, this flag is heavy 2, it's locked, it's complex. That means they know they have to go and unlock it, pick it up with 2 hands, carry it over, and then, score with it by scoring 1 through 10.
And are all these tags, at least the tags you commonly use, are they captured in the Book of War?
They are.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, so again, we're reviewing the Book of War here with Gorin. So let's talk, moving into, as you call it, the toolbox here. What are some considerations about the battlefield?
So when designing a battle game, you have to take a variety of elements into consideration on the battlefield. Things such as spawn points, bases, where the objectives are, and the spacing of those things is really important because it lets you control a huge variety of aspects on the field. And it allows you to control things like fighter density. It lets you control, how much time it takes for someone to get from a spawn point to a base. We separate our nirvanas from our spawn points so that there's a very clear place where all the dead players are and they're out of play, and a very clear place where they're going to re-enter play. That lowers the confusion factor a ton. Because I'm sure everybody in Amtgard has been in an area of the battlefield where they have to constantly ask, who's alive and who's dead, because it's near a nirvana or near a spawn point or whatever, and everyone's just kind of milling around. This sort of, we try really hard to separate those. Those are some common elements.
Okay. Sticking with Battlefield a little bit more, talk to me about terrain. Do you use the tag system for terrain? Different ways for representing terrain?
Sure, we have all kinds of different ways for representing. Most of the time it's flagging tape because that's cheap and easy. There's a whole lot of different terrain that you can use. Some of it is in the Book of War, and I'm sure people can come up with hundreds of different examples. But the common ones that we use would be water, moving water, like death terrain, and obscured vision terrain. So smoke or fog or darkness, those sorts of things.
Okay.
And they all have their own effects on players that are in it. And it's, again, if you have that common language and everybody understands what obscured vision is, that's real simple. And you can apply that and say, okay, this area is dark, it counts as obscured vision. Or this area over here is a pit, it counts as death terrain. Or this over here is water, etc. And those are pretty common. In addition to that, I use a lot of walls in those kinds of terrain as well. Terrain is incredibly useful for completely changing the nature of your field, which can completely change the nature of your battle game. I can play the same battle game 4 different times in a day, and through the use of terrain, make everyone feel like a completely different battle game. And so that's a really useful tool to create variety in your games.
You got a pretty robust section moving on past the battlefield or the battleground, moving into objectives. Pretty robust section here. What are some of your examples of the various objectives you'll find in the book?
So in the book, there's we have categories of objectives, and there's a bunch of objectives within that. But primarily, they revolve around killing or destroying something or someone, moving something or someone from place to place. So the first one would be a kill objective. There are travel objectives in which you try to move something from one place to another. There are capture objectives and defend objectives, and all of these have all kinds of different objectives within them. And you can combine these objectives to create all kinds of different battle games. And in fact, I recommend having a combination of objectives, which we'll probably talk about more here in a minute. But a huge different example. But you could series of categories. Generally, those can all be broken down into these different primary categories. There's really only so many different ways to interact with things in the game.
Okay. So talk about interacting with the game and your 50-50 chance of success and who is in the struggle you mentioned previously. What are some different considerations for how to best balance a battle game so they've got that 50-50 shot?
And this is another thing where we talked earlier about the mistakes you can make is when balancing a game. So it's really important to try to balance a game before it starts. I see a lot of Reeves make the mistake of balancing games, mid-game. Generally, it's because the only way that people seem to be able to balance a game is by moving players around. And what a lot of people fail to understand is that when you move a player from one team to another, you didn't just increase the one team by 1, you decrease the other by 2, which is essentially a 2-person change. And that can have huge impacts in a game. It's also not a lot of fun, and when players on your team change to enemies, that increases the confusion factor, because if the player wasn't paying attention when you moved them, they have no idea why this guy's killing him now who was their buddy 2 minutes ago. So that's bad. There's a ton of different ways to balance games. And they can be as simple as making one team spawn 20 feet farther away from the objective than the other team, which allows one team to get there a little bit quicker. Other ways that you can change it is death count is a really good one. So if you have a 60 count death, if a team is just getting rolled, give them a faster respawn. Tell them, okay, you guys come back in 40 seconds. Other things you can do is, like in all of our battle games, we use a point system to decide who wins. So if you capture the flag, it's worth 10 points. Well, the players don't necessarily need to know the exact point breakdown. They just know that capturing the flag is a primary objective, so they're trying to do that. Primary objectives are worth the most points. But for one team, it might be worth 10. For the other team, it might be worth 8. If that team's got a lot of veteran players on it, or if they're just obviously outmatching the other team, we can give them that disadvantage, handicap, as it were. And that using those kinds of balancing factors allows you to create games that are unbalanced based on the players, which could be what the players want. And an example might be if you have a company that really wants to fight together, but they're pretty well equipped and they're pretty veteran players and they're pretty serious fighters. So pitting them against a team that outnumbers the heck out of them could be a way to do that, or just letting them have an even team, but saying, okay, well, if these guys manage to capture the flag, it's worth 20 points. If you guys capture it, it's worth 5. You better get to work. And a lot of players in those situations won't have a problem being at a disadvantage because they're getting to play the way they want to, and that's really far more important than deciding who wins or loses. But those are lots of different ways to balance a game without moving players around.
Okay, now you said each of the games are usually based off of a scoring system and things like that. And then earlier before, when you were talking about the objectives, that sometimes there's multiple objectives in one game. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit?
Absolutely. I strongly encourage battle game designers to use multiple objectives, at least 2, maybe 3. And so we have primary objectives and secondary objectives. Primary objectives are worth a whole ton of points, and the secondary objectives are worth less. Quidditch is a really good example of how that works, right? You catch the snitch, it's worth a ton of points, ends the game, whatever. The rest of the players are playing a game that's totally different and worth far less points. So a good example might be, say, if you're doing capture the flag. I'll use that example a lot because it's easy to understand. And capturing the flag is a primary example. A good secondary objective for that game would be what we call a meat grinder, which is where you just get a point for every enemy that you kill. So every time an enemy player spawns, a point is assigned to your team. And that might be 1 point. So, depending on how many players you have in the field, you just change the flag to compensate. So capturing a flag might be worth 20 points in a big game where there's lots of deaths. And what that does is it goes back to that very initial concept of making sure everybody in the game can participate. Because I might not care about capturing a flag if I'm going to go out there, in 6 points of armor and play a warrior and just try to slaughter as many fools as I can to get points. I'm not going to be running around with a flag and all that armor, I can tell you that. But Joe Newbie, who's been around for a couple of months and likes to play assassin a lot and backstab people, but he's small and really fast, he's going to capture that flag at least once. And he's going to feel like total MVP when he does it. And if that team manages to win because they got an extra flag capture in, he's literally the hero of the day, even though he's not a great fighter. That newbie he's going to be hooked on Amtgard forever if he can do that once in a while. And so having those multiple objectives is huge.
Okay. So I know Book of War covered a lot of the stuff, the building blocks, if you will, that we've discussed. Are there battle game examples and things like that in the book?
Yeah, there's a whole series of what I call basic battle games, which are just simple with just one or one primary, maybe one secondary objective. And then there are some advanced battle games, which introduce like a whole bunch of complex concepts, like maybe complicated terrain or, having 2 or 3 objectives going on simultaneously. And so there's a whole bunch of battle game examples in there, as well as a whole lot of examples on how to map out a battle game so that you can present it to your players. So in my park, my field officers are required to post the rules for the battle games of the weekend no later than Wednesday by 5 p.m. So they post that, and that includes a map of what the field's going to look like and how everybody can interact. The great thing about that is it gives us a few days to work out any kinks if the players are like, hey, what happens if in this scenario? I get to answer those before we get out to the field, which is great. So that lowers the confusion factor again. And the players get a good visual of what's happening, a good understanding of what's happening. They can decide what classes they're going to play, what spell lists they're going to use, etc., before they even get to the field. In my park, we play indoors in the wintertime, so we're paying by the hour, sometimes as much as like $165 an hour to play Amtgard. So we want to maximize our field time. So having players spend 15 minutes to figure out what class they're going to play or what spells they're going to use is a huge waste of our money. So we try to do it all offline.
Okay. And then one of the last portions of Book of War, again, sticking to the book, not so much how to build a battle game.
Right.
Discuss the tournaments. Why'd you include that in the Book of War?
Dude, I can't tell you how many champions I've had step up who have no idea how to run a tournament. And, You know, it may not be in an informal tournament. It may not be a big deal for someone to sort of stumble their way through it. But you get into Weapon Masters and War Masters, and it's really nice to have a smooth tournament that people can understand. So, so I just put examples on how to run a single elimination tournament or single elimination bracket. Excuse me, brackets with a loser bracket. So double elimination essentially. How to run a round robin. How to run a King of the Hill or Bear Pit or tournament, and then how to run combination tournaments, and introduce them to that concept. Because if you have a ton of fighters, you may not want to do a giant bracket. You might do a couple of small round robins to isolate the top 8 or 16 players, and then have them do a bracket, things like that. So it just introduces them to the concept, shows them how to seed, which is really important. A lot of people don't understand the concept of seeding, and so the whole thing is just how do I run field activities, essentially the whole book. So I've found it to be really, really useful to hand to new champions or new GMRs or just Reeves in general and say, here, read this. It'll give you a really good foundation for what we're doing. And then if you have questions, you're going to feel far more educated when you ask them, and your games are going to be a lot smoother. Your players will have a lot more fun, and your Amtgard will grow because of it, which is, I think, critical.
Okay. That about brings us to the end of the interview. Is there anything else you'd like to discuss or talk about on the Book of War?
As far as the Book of War, no. It's available, I guess, through, I don't know, me. I'll find a way to publish it. Maybe I'll throw it out, or you can provide a link to it
we'll put a link on
when you do this. I would recommend that anybody that is interested in game design read it. When you do, look at it as a guide, a bunch of suggestions. It's not like a hard-coded Bible where if you don't do it this way, you're obviously a fool. Just use it to sort of give yourself some ideas and perspective, and it'll help your battle game design game, as it were. And if I were to say the one thing that you want to develop above all others in this is that common language concept. The more frequently you use that, the better your games will be. Because when people get confused, they don't have fun. So eliminate that confusion factor.
Got it. I think that's a great way to wrap things up. Again, thank you for taking your time to sit with us in this spotlight interview. And we spent the last couple minutes here talking with Gorin on his latest release, The Book of War. Thanks again.
You're welcome.